All right, so today let's tackle something that's been all over the news lately, and I know it's a big deal for our listeners who are prepping for the UPSC exams.
Mm.
We're talking about caste-based discrimination, specifically in Indian universities. And, it's one of those issues that could definitely come up in either the mains or the prelims.
Oh, absolutely. It's a big one. And it seems like it keeps coming up over and over again in current affairs. And it's just a really complicated issue with, so much history behind it.
Exactly, and that's why we're doing a deep dive on it today. We're using a recent article from the Hindu to sort of break it down and highlight the key points for you guys because, you're all super busy studying, so we want to make this as efficient as possible. So imagine for a second you've worked your whole life, you ace your exams, you get into, one of the best universities in the country, and then you face discrimination because of your caste. It's a pretty harsh reality for a lot of students in India.
Yeah, it is. And it really has some serious consequences, not just for the students themselves, but for Indian society as a whole.
That's right, and that's why we really need to unpack this. So first off, what does this discrimination actually look like on a university campus?
Well, it can be very subtle sometimes, like being excluded from study groups or social circles. Or it can be much more overt, like outright harassment, bias grading, or even, being denied opportunities for research or internships.
So it's not always like, blatant bullying or anything, but it's more about this kind of systematic exclusion from opportunities,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. And the impact of that can be just devastating. I mean, think about it. You're already in this incredibly competitive environment. There's so much pressure to succeed. And then you have this added layer of discrimination on top of it all. It's no wonder that students end up dropping out, struggling with mental health, and in some really tragic cases, even suicide.
It's heartbreaking, really.
Yeah.
And the statistics are just grim. One study by the Forum Against Oppression of SCSTs found that something like 70% of Dalit and Adivasi students in the IITs experience some form of caste discrimination.
Yeah, that's a shocking number. And what's maybe even more concerning is that this isn't just coming from other students, The study found that it often comes from faculty members as well, which can have a huge impact on a student's academic progress.
Right, because if the people who are grading you or deciding who gets research opportunities are biased against you,
Yeah,
that's a massive hurdle to overcome.
it is. And we can see that reflected in other data too. For example, between 2015 and 2019, the representation of SC, ST, and OBC students in PhD programs at IIT Bombay was incredibly low.
So basically, even getting into these top institutions doesn't automatically mean you'll have equal access to all the opportunities they offer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. There was a field experiment that showed that low caste applicants actually need to send out 20% more resumes than high caste applicants just to get the same number of callbacks for job interviews. So this discrimination can really impact their careers long after they graduate.
Wow, that's a huge disadvantage right from the start. And then, of course, there are the tragic cases of student suicides, like Rohit Amela at the University of Hyderabad and Payal Tadvi in Mumbai. Those cases really brought this issue to the forefront.
Yeah, they were incredibly painful reminders of the human cost of this discrimination. And, they sparked those nationwide protests and really forced people to confront the reality of caste bias in higher education.
It's a reminder that this isn't just some theoretical issue. It has real-life, devastating consequences.
Yeah.
So with all of this in mind, what's actually being done to address it? I mean, there are laws and guidelines in place, right?
Yes, there are. India has a legal framework that's supposed to tackle this. For example, the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989. That act provides legal protection against caste-based violence and discrimination.
Okay, but what about within universities specifically?
So the University Grants Commission, or the UGC, they have guidelines that mandate that universities have to set up these anti-discrimination cells specifically to address caste bias. And then obviously there's the Indian Constitution itself, with Articles 15 and 17, which prohibit any form of discrimination based on caste.
And then there's also the reservation policy, which is designed to ensure representation of SC, ST, and OBC students in admissions and faculty positions.
Right, so there is a framework in place, but the challenge often comes down to the implementation and enforcement of these laws and guidelines.
Okay, so where's the gap? Where are things falling short?
Well, one of the biggest issues is the lack of SC, ST, and OBC faculty members. And this really contributes to a sense of isolation for students from these communities. Having mentors and role models who understand their experiences is just crucial.
Yeah, it's about feeling seen and supported, especially in a challenging environment like a top university. But it sounds like that's not always the case.
Unfortunately not. And actually, there's a surprisingly low compliance rate with the UGC guidelines. A lot of institutions, even some really prestigious ones, haven't even submitted data on their equal opportunity cells, which are supposed to be addressing discrimination.
So even with the rules in place, there's a lack of accountability and transparency.
Exactly. And this lack of enforcement is something the Supreme Court has highlighted as a major problem. They've really stressed the need for stronger mechanisms to ensure these regulations are actually being followed.
Okay, so we've got the laws, we've got the guidelines, and we even have the Supreme Court pushing for change. But it's pretty clear that that's not enough. What else needs to happen to really make a difference here?
Well, I think it comes down to going beyond just ticking boxes. On compliance reports, we need to see a real cultural shift within these institutions.
When you say cultural shift, what do you mean by that?
Well, think about it this way. For a student from a marginalized community, just getting admitted to a top university can be a huge accomplishment in itself, right? They've already overcome so many barriers just to get there. But then they enter this environment where they may constantly feel like they don't truly belong.
Like they have to prove themselves over and over again in a way that other students don't.
Exactly. So universities need to create a space where these students actually feel welcomed and supported, not just tolerated. And that takes a lot more than just having, diversity quotas.
Okay, so how do you create that kind of inclusive environment? Where do you even start?
Well, increasing the representation of SC, ST, and OBC faculty members is a good place to start. It's not just about having, diverse faces on the staff directory. It's about having people who can really mentor and guide students from similar backgrounds.
Because they've walked that path themselves. They understand the challenges in a way that others might not.
Exactly. And it goes beyond the faculty, too. What about the curriculum itself? Are the perspectives and experiences of marginalized communities actually being represented? Are there opportunities for open dialogue about caste and the impact of discrimination?
So you're saying it's about weaving inclusivity into the very fabric of the university, from the faculty to the curriculum to the overall campus culture.
Exactly. And we can't forget about mental health support. These students are facing a lot of unique pressures, and universities need to provide the resources to address those needs.
Yeah, it's recognizing that mental well-being is essential for academic success, and then providing the support to make sure these students can thrive.
Absolutely. And speaking of support, what about the systems for reporting discrimination when it does happen? Are those systems effective? Are students confident that their complaints will be taken seriously?
Right, because if you don't have a system that feels safe and trustworthy, people are less likely to come forward, and then the problem just festers beneath the surface.
Exactly. And even when complaints are filed, what are the consequences for those who are found guilty of discrimination? Are they just slaps on the wrist, or are there real repercussions?
There has to be a sense of accountability. Otherwise, what's the incentive for people to change their behavior?
Exactly. And I think all of this comes back to that idea of a cultural shift. It's about creating an environment where discrimination isn't just frowned upon, but where it's actively challenged and addressed at every level.
It's about moving beyond tolerance to genuine respect and understanding.
Right. And that involves having some tough conversations, some real self-reflection, and a willingness to actually dismantle the power structures that have allowed this discrimination to persist for so long.
So we've talked about the institutional changes that need to happen. But what about the broader societal context? How does that factor into all of this?
That's a crucial point. Universities don't exist in a vacuum. They're a reflection of the society they're in. So if we want to see real change in our universities, we need to address the root causes of caste discrimination in society as a whole.
So it's a much bigger conversation than just what's happening on campus.
Absolutely. We're talking about addressing economic inequality, challenging these entrenched social hierarchies, and promoting education and awareness about caste and its impact.
Because ultimately, these students are coming to university after spending their entire lives navigating a society that's already stratified by caste.
Exactly. So even if a university manages to create this perfectly inclusive environment, those students are still going back out into a world where those biases and inequalities exist.
It's like treating the symptoms without addressing the underlying disease.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And that's why this issue is so complex and challenging. There's no quick fix. It requires a multifaceted approach that involves legal reforms, institutional changes, and a broader societal transformation.
Which brings us back to the role of education itself. Can't education be a powerful tool for social change?
Oh, absolutely. I think education plays a vital role in breaking down these barriers. And I'm not just talking about university-level education. We need to start much earlier incorporating caste awareness into school curriculums, teaching children about equality and empathy and the importance of challenging prejudice.
So if you can instill those values from a young age, it can have a ripple effect throughout society.
Exactly. And education isn't just about what's taught in classrooms either. It's also about the role models we expose young people to, the stories we tell, the conversations we have.
It's about creating a culture where diversity is celebrated and where everyone feels like they belong.
Right. And it's about empowering individuals to question the status quo, to think critically about injustice, and to be agents of change in their own communities.
And that's where things start to get really interesting. Because if we can educate a generation to be more aware, more empathetic, and more committed to social justice, then real change becomes possible.
It does, and I think that's where the hope lies. Because ultimately, dismantling caste discrimination isn't just about policy changes or institutional reforms, it's about changing hearts and minds.
It's about recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, regardless of their caste background.
And creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive and reach their full potential.
It's easy to get overwhelmed by the scale of this problem, but hearing you talk about the potential for education to drive change, it does feel like there's a path forward.
There is. It's a long and difficult path, but it's one worth taking.
And I think that's an important message for our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams. This issue isn't just a topic to be memorized for a test, it's a call to action.
It is, because the future of India depends on creating a more just and equitable society for all of its citizens.
Okay, so we've talked about the legal framework and the need for real cultural change within universities and the broader societal context. But I want to kind of circle back to something you mentioned earlier about merit. It seems like that word gets thrown around a lot in these discussions about caste, but I don't think everyone defines it the same way.
Oh, that's a great point. The concept of merit is often used to just kind of justify the status quo and resist efforts to actually level the playing field. But what we often see is that this idea of merit is really a product of privilege itself.
So are you saying that students from privileged backgrounds have a head start not because they're, inherently more talented or hardworking, but because they've had access to better resources and opportunities?
Exactly. Think about it. They've probably gone to better schools, they've had access to private tutors, they've grown up in environments where academic success is just expected and nurtured. That doesn't mean they haven't worked hard, but it does mean that they're starting the race from a different point on the track.
Right, so for students from marginalized communities, even getting to the starting line can be a huge struggle in itself. And then they're being judged by the same standards as those who haven't faced those same obstacles.
Exactly. It's like comparing apples and oranges. And that's why it's so crucial to challenge this very narrow definition of merit and recognize all of the systemic factors that contribute to inequality.
Because if we don't, then we're basically just perpetuating a system that rewards privilege and completely ignores all those barriers faced by people from marginalized communities.
Exactly. And that's why initiatives like the reservation policy are so important. They're not about lowering standards or giving handouts or anything like that. It's about creating a more level playing field and ensuring that opportunities are accessible to everyone, regardless of their background.
It's about recognizing that talent and potential exist in all communities, and then creating a system that allows those talents to actually flourish.
Right. And it's about understanding that true merit can only be assessed when everyone has an equal chance to develop their abilities in the first place.
So for our listeners, especially those who are prepping for the UPSC, this is a really important point to understand. Don't just accept these simplistic notions of merit at face value. Dig deeper. Question the assumptions, and really consider the systemic factors that contribute to inequality.
Because that kind of critical thinking is essential not just for the exam, but for being an informed and engaged citizen.
Absolutely. Now, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier about the power of education to drive social change. How can we actually translate all of this into concrete action? What can our listeners do to be a part of the solution?
Well, first and foremost, I would say don't underestimate the power of individual actions. Even small things can make a difference.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Sure. So educate yourself about caste and its impact. Read books, watch documentaries, have conversations with people from different backgrounds. The more you understand the issue, the better equipped you'll be to actually challenge prejudice and advocate for change.
So it starts with awareness and a willingness to learn and grow.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to speak up when you see injustice. Whether it's calling out a casual casteist remark or supporting initiatives that promote equality, your voice matters.
Yeah, even those small acts of resistance can contribute to a larger movement for change.
Right. And remember, this isn't just about abstract ideas, it's about real people's lives. So connect with those human stories behind the statistics. Empathize with the struggles of those who face discrimination and celebrate their achievements.
Because it's through that human connection that we can really understand the agency and the importance of this issue.
Exactly. And finally, I would say don't give up hope. Change is possible, but it requires sustained effort and commitment from all of us.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. So stay engaged, stay informed, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable society.
And on that note, we'd love to hear from you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on this issue? What actions are you taking to address caste discrimination in your own communities? Share your experiences and your insights in the comments below.
Yeah, because your perspectives are valuable, and together we can create a more inclusive and equitable India for everyone.
And don't forget, this entire deep dive was based on a recent article from The Hindu. So make sure you check out that article for a more in-depth understanding of the issue.
And if you found this episode helpful, please like and subscribe and share it with your fellow UPSC aspirants, and keep those questions coming.
We're here to help you navigate all the complexities of current affairs and prepare you for the challenges ahead. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better tomorrow.